All right, now that we've given folks a little moment to select their language, just wanted to begin tonight by doing a brief land acknowledgement and want to formally and with great respect acknowledge that we're on unceded traditional ancestral lands of the Yokuts and the Miwoks people. We recognize that we have played a role in the displacement of these peoples and also recognize that their knowledge on the systems and practices can help advance environmental justice movements. And we here at CVAQ commit to uplifting the vision of Indigenous leaders to be able to build a sustainable future. So tonight's discussion is being hosted by the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, CVAQ, and CVAQ is a broad and diverse coalition unified in our advocacy to restore clean air to the San Joaquin Valley, like I mentioned, traditionally on unceded Yokuts and Miwoks land. We envision a healthy and safe San Joaquin Valley that's also economically prosperous, where chronic air pollution and the sickness due to poor air quality are eliminated. So I introduced myself, let you know a little bit about CVAQ and the work that we do. I'm so interested in knowing who's on the meeting tonight. So if you could drop in the chat your name, if you're affiliated with any organizations, and just so we're able to, guide this conversation. We have proposed a question for you. How have you seen climate change impacting your community? We'll give folks a little moment there to add in the chat. So welcome, Grayson. Welcome, Ken. Feel free to drop in your chat name, any affiliations. How have you seen climate change impact your community? Great. Thanks, everybody. I see them all rolling in. Welcome, everybody. So CVAQ's core work is traditionally been on air quality, but air quality is linked to climate change and some of the same sources like we're seeing here, factories, oil fields, vehicle exhaust, agriculture are also impacting our climate change in the region. So with that said, I'm just going to pass it over to my colleague Pedro to be able to dive into a little bit of the context a little bit deeper.
Can we go to the climate change definition? It's not there. Maybe it's next. Yeah, thank you. So, hi everyone. Good evening. My name is Pedro Hernandez. I am the new deputy director with CVAQ. So it's good to see so many of you on this call. And again, we hope to be sponsoring more of these informational webinars and creating more content out here to provide residents here in the San Joaquin Valley the information that they have a right to know regarding the changing environment and changing climate. And so to start off the discussion, we wanted to make sure we all knew what we were talking about when we were referring to climate change. And so I know this might not need repeating for some of the folks on the call, but we wanted to at least ground the discussion in a common thread for all the rest of the information we'll be sharing tonight. So according to the United Nations, climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. So these can be natural, and definitely throughout the history of planet Earth, the environment and the climate has changed. But what is really unique about this point in time is that the rate of change is being increased and is quickening due to human-caused activity. In particular, it is the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, but it's also how we change the ecosystem to reduce less carbon and to not provide as much support as far as the impacts of climate change. So, we're seeing a lot of wildfires and drought and hurricanes and a lot of stuff in the news now. And so again, the main issue of this point in time is things are being accelerated. And so many of the discussions we're having tonight is around solutions and trying to get to a little of explanations for the causes of this issue. So next slide, please, Cynthia. And so I also wanted to ground us in a little bit of history to make sure at least that we all have a common grounding in how we got here as well. And believe me, we could have our own hour-long discussion on just history, and maybe that's something we could entertain in the future. But just for the narrative thread of how we got here, the picture on the far left is a picture from, I believe, 1902 of Yolka's women in actually Madera County. And so I wanted to start off with an indigenous history and an indigenous acknowledgement, because again, these are some of the original people that were settled in this region. And due to the expansion of European countries into the Americas and colonialization efforts from those European countries, but also the colonial efforts from the Mexican government and the United States government thereafter, many of these communities were displaced through wars of subjugation, resulting in genocide, resulting in loss of a lot of culture and the loss of a lot of traditional knowledge of the land as well too. And I also wanted to show this picture on the far left because even in spite of that history, many of these communities have continued to survive and exist even here in the region as well too. So while many of these communities have been oppressed by multiple different governments in California and the United States and American history, many of them still have survived and continue to be stewards of the land and continue to be neighbors and residents of this region as well. And pivoting to the middle image is actually a picture of California colonists cutting down a huge oak tree. And I think this is very symbolic because what happened after and as a direct result of colonialization in California is that our ecosystem, the very environment, was fundamentally altered. And for some, it was either altered for increased farming activity or mining to clear land for different communities. But more broadly, the takeaway here is that there has been a fundamental altering of the environment and the land here in the San Joaquin Valley. And so the history, another main lesson that I would like to just, impart here is that the San Joaquin Valley is one of the most fundamentally altered ecosystems in the country. And so this one image hopefully can demonstrate the larger trend that has happened in virtually every part of the valley, from the valley floor up to the valley foothills, and even in some of the mountain regions surrounding us as well. And so kind of getting to climate change, right, and pollution and the environmental injustices as well that ground a lot of the reasons why I think all of us are united here tonight. I have a picture of oil fields in Kern County. And this can be, anything from a warehouse in South Fresno. This can be an open ag burn. But what the takeaway I would like from this image to be is that in fundamentally changing the natural habitats and ecosystems of the valley, humans have created another landscape that has not only contributed to the pollution that causes so many environmental injustices and public health risks like contaminated water, contaminated air quality, but also these activities have exacerbated the rate of climate change. And so we have two huge issues here that we're now all trying to resolve. Is one, the different pollutants, and then two, the other things that are being thrown into the air that are worsening climate change. And the changing climate is exacerbating a lot of other health issues, like increased temperatures. Here in the San Joaquin Valley, we have some of the highest rates of heat-related mortality, particularly among the farm working community as well too. And so these threads and this history, I think, is really important for all of us to understand where we are and where we need to go. So if we can get the next slide, please, Cynthia. And as I mentioned earlier, this has resulted in some of the highest persistent levels of poverty. We grow a lot of the food with this changed landscape, but we have some of the highest rates of food insecurity, where people that work the land don't have access to the food they grow. We have some of the highest rates of air, water, and soil contamination. And we also have the unequal health and social costs onto communities of color in particular. And next slide, please, Cynthia. And so part of the climate justice solutions that CVAQ works on, and hopefully that will ground the rest of this discussion, is a just transition of fossil fuels, realizing that we need a different energy system that is cleaner, ecosystem restoration. So how can we restore the habitat to provide some of these natural services that have been lost over time, decarbonization of buildings, changing our agricultural system to be more regenerative and take care of our planet. And also a big part, and I'll maybe conclude here, is accountability for decision makers. Because we know, again, that we know a lot of the solutions. I just gave you 5 of the big solutions, but also we want to make sure that the solutions are approved and implemented across agencies and state and local governments as well too. And hopefully at the end of the day, this can lead to liberation of the communities. And so where we can have healthy environments and where none of us have to be, unnecessarily unhealthy. So with that said, I'll end my time here and hand it over back to Cynthia to introduce our panelists. But thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you, Pedro, for that context setting. So I'm going to just quickly introduce tonight's guest speakers who will be diving into the research that they did for this climate assessment of the Valley region. We have Pablo Ortiz, senior bilingual climate and water scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He plans, designs, and carries out primary analysis on changing climate patterns that are impacting key sectors and populations, especially with regards to precipitation and water supply changes. Pablo also works on developing strategies for vulnerable sectors and people in California to cope and adapt to current and projected impacts of climate change, mainly related to water impacts. And we also have Angel S. Fernando Bo. He's a researcher at UC Merced with a background in environmental and socioeconomic systems engineering. And he is the current president of the nonprofit Porvenir. Angel's work is centered on sustainability and climate change, and it orbits around serving vulnerable communities with a focus on the future of sustainable agriculture in California, breaking language barriers, and democratizing science, technology, and education. So with that introduction, please feel free to share your screen, and please, everybody, help me in welcoming them.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Yes, well, thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you for the introduction, both Pedro and Cynthia. I think yes, all good. Yeah, you said, I mean, some concepts. It's very important to have the definition of climate change. If you want, I can give you another definition, maybe more direct than the one from the United Nations. Climate change means more extremes, more frequent, and more intense. And probably we will repeat some things that Pedro has already said But yes, please bear with me, because there are many things that have to be said about climate change. We just have 20 minutes to talk about this. And well, we're going to talk about this report, but before we continue, I would like to thank all the co-authors who volunteered their time to work on this report, especially the lead authors. And we are lucky today, we have Leticia here with me, and we have also Chantelis in the public. So if we have difficult questions, they can respond. And this is the San Joaquin Valley. It's surrounded by the beautiful Sierra Nevada, the coastal range, the Delta. I know it's very obvious, but it's very important to explain some fundamental details that make the San Joaquin Valley what it is, right? For example, the air quality in the San Joaquin Valley is the worst in the United States, and that's caused in part by the structure of the valley, because it's surrounded by mountains, and that makes the air stagnant. Less than 200 years ago, the San Joaquin Valley was a big, humid area of ephemeral rivers and lakes. The Tulare Lake was a permanent lake, larger in size than Los Angeles. So this comes very close to what Pedro was saying, right? So this is a huge change that you can see from space, and it cuts the links from indigenous people to the original landscape of California. This lake was part of the culture of some indigenous people, and we can talk for days about this. This is basically how California looked in 1851, and this is how it looks today. The San Joaquin Valley has lost 95% of its original wetlands. We dried the Tulare Lake, we put dams to prevent flooding of our cities, to provide cheap water for agriculture. But drying the San Joaquin Valley had a cost, and that cost was decreasing the valley's resilience to climate change. In other words, 2 centuries ago, the San Joaquin Valley looked like this, the Merced Wildlife Refuge, and this is what we have left now. This is the Kern River running dry in Bakersfield. And now Pablo is going to tell us a little bit more about climate change and droughts.
Thank you so much, Angel, and thank you everyone for being here. And what I hope to show you today is that climate change is making the already harsh conditions in the San Joaquin Valley even harsher. And in relation to climate change and drought, climate change is changing how, when, and where California gets water. And then these changes have profound implications for the state, for the environment, and therefore for us. And with that comes a call to action to all of us to be conscious about the ways that we live, and also to let our representatives know that we want them to do everything in their power to reduce the vulnerability of our most vulnerable communities in the valley and improve living conditions. Next slide, Angel, please. So by now, I hope that the idea that the world's climate is changing is not a surprise to anyone here. And as we keep increasing the concentrations of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, this creates a blanket that makes the world to get hotter. And then this includes hotter temperatures for the air, but also for the water. So basically the temperatures of the oceans are also increasing. And then this modifies the climate as we know it. What this map shows here is the difference in temperatures relative to pre-industrial levels. And pre-industrial levels are roughly from 1850 to the 1900s. So the darker the red, the hotter it was, the darker the blue, the cooler it was. So this is what it looked like about 130 years ago. It was fairly normal, a bit hotter in some places, a bit cooler in other places. And then we move to about 70 years ago. Heat is rising and the cooling is declining. 50 years ago. About 20 years ago. 15 years ago. This is basically how it is now. And it's actually worse because this is already from 4 years ago and it is only getting hotter. Next slide, please. So 2020 tied with 2016 at the hottest year on record. And last year, 2021 was the 6th hottest year in record. And the questions are, what are the changes derived from heating the earth in our San Joaquin Valley? And in particular, how are they related to the current drought, because it's an important topic, and also how it is affecting our communities in the San Joaquin Valley. These are some of the changes that we are already seeing, which is there is more precipitation falling as rain and less as snow. The snow that accumulates in the Sierra Nevada or in the mountains is melting earlier in the season. And then in California, this snowpack is vital because it is a natural form of water storage that melts during the spring. It fills our reservoirs with water that will later use for agriculture. Also, there's an increase on water use and a reduced water availability, mainly driven by increased temperatures. And this, of course, leads that if there is less water available in the surface, then we increase our dependence on groundwater, which is a particularly important topic for the San Joaquin Valley. Also, there is already more extreme precipitation events, and in general, what it means is when it's dry, it's going to be drier, and when it rains, it will rain stronger. And of course, there is also the direct effects from rising temperatures, which is the extreme heat. And anyone that lives in the valley is already very familiar with this kind of heat. Next slide. If you read the news, maybe a couple of weeks, you saw some of these headlines, no? The West mega drought worsens to the driest in at least 1,200 years. So this is from a study from UCLA and Columbia University, and they found that the last 22 years have been the driest 22-year period in the Western United States in at least 1,200 years. And it says at least because that's how far the reconstructed data goes. So it could go back even further. And then this graph shows drought conditions in the Western states during those 22 years. And despite some wet years like 2005, 2010, 2017, basically the soil moisture in our soils have been unable to recover from a soil moisture deficit since the year 2000. So this is what is called a mega drought, which is a dry period in certain area lasting in the order of decades. And part of this study is making so many headlines because they also calculated that about 42% of this mega drought can be attributed to human-caused climate change. Also, as you can see in this graph, these dry periods are coming at a rate that doesn't allow us to recover, and we are becoming more vulnerable and less resilient against drought. So now let's talk really fast about the drought impacts according to these different drought categories or the drought colors, so that we can have a sense of the difference in this. And I'm only going to focus on the red and the darker red, which are the two worst categories. So first, we have the extreme drought, and extreme drought translates into livestock at risk due to the little pasture that we have, damage to fruit trees, and even some orchards needs to be removed. There are water supply deficits that lead to new well drilling, and there is also over extraction of groundwater. Then the aquifer levels decrease, and we have private and community wells going dry, and this is particularly in disadvantaged communities. Also, there is more fuel, so the fire season becomes longer and the fires become more intense. It even impacts recreational activities like skiing, boating, and rafting. And ecosystems are, of course, also very damaged because there is little native food and water available for animals. Even hydropower is restricted because there is less water available in our reservoirs, so we cannot use many of the reservoirs to produce hydropower. And then this takes us back to supplying that energy by burning again more fossil fuels and emitting more heat trapping gases, basically creating this feedback loop with climate change. And then we have an even worse category of drought, that is the exceptional drought category. This category basically exacerbates all of the above, and also agricultural yields are low. Some fields are left fallow, and more orchards needs to be removed. The fire season becomes very costly, and also the smoke and the dry dust decreases the air quality, which is already very bad, and it further affects our health. Also, the water is low in the rivers, and temperatures are high, and this leads to an increase in fish mortality. Agricultural unemployment is also high. Surface water is depleted, more wells go dry, more water shortages, and these water shortages are widespread, and the water quality also decreases as some of the contaminants get concentrated. And I'll send it back to Angel.
Thank you, Pablo. This figure summarizes what Pablo is saying, more or less related about water and the context of the San Joaquin Valley and our main source of water, that is the Sierra Nevada. This figure shows the retreat of the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, which is the main source of surface water, which is the cheap water for agriculture. Precipitation will fall more as rainfall and less as snow in the Sierras, as Pablo says, and the snowmelt will be earlier when the water is not really needed for agriculture. So dams will have to release water from winter floods to avoid catastrophic failure, and we may have less surface water availability. And when we think about the water balance and how it affects us and how it affects the agriculture, that is the engine, the economic engine of the San Joaquin Valley, groundwater is already unsustainable. You can see we have a 1.85 million acre feet of overdraft. This is roughly the water used at home by half of all 40 million Californians. So that's a lot of water. This depletion, this pumping of groundwater is destroying the infrastructure in the San Joaquin Valley because it's sinking the soil, it's creating subsidence. As you can see in this very famous picture of how the soil sunk over the years. Groundwater overdraft is also preventing some disadvantaged communities or some rural communities, private owner wells, to access their aquifer, no? Because their wells are relatively shallow and the groundwater level is deeper and deeper. And climate change will create more instability about water. Crop water use will increase with heat. That's the big green arrow. Each plant will need more water to do the same than they do now. We will have less control over surface water for irrigation due to the earlier snowmelt that may cause more frequent floods. Sea level rise may require increase in environmental flows to push salty water away from the valley. This means more water in our rivers, which is good, but this water comes from the cities and from the agriculture. And things are already difficult for agriculture, and they will be more difficult again in the future since we don't have enough water to sustain our current practices. And the future is going to be more water demanding. Also, the number of chill hours, horas de frío in Espanol, these chill hours are the hours of temperatures below 45 Fahrenheit or 7 Celsius. These are decreasing, and some high value crops such as pistachios or walnuts or peaches, for example, require enough chill hours per year to maintain their quality and their yield. With climate change, they may not obtain enough cold during the winter to be feasible. And what about the people in the San Joaquin Valley, especially in our many small rural disadvantaged communities? So the San Joaquin Valley has 4.3 million inhabitants, of which 55% live in disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged communities are in blue in this map. Many rural disadvantaged communities, and probably you already know, but they suffer from extremely low water quality. The San Joaquin Valley, as I said before, has the worst air quality in the United States, and probably you already know it and experienced it. And that's true for metropolitan areas, but sometimes in rural areas it's even worse with pesticide spray and these kind of things. Climate change is a greater threat to frontline communities of the San Joaquin Valley because they often lack the fundamental infrastructure to be resilient. They don't have access to drinking water, to sewage, to green areas, to health services, to education, even sidewalks that are very important for the elderly. So people experience extreme heat, as Pablo is saying, but often they don't have the means to pay for air conditioning. And that's even worse for farm workers, as Pedro was saying, because they work under the sun, and the extreme heat days will be 5, maybe 10 times more frequent than they are now. Let's say you have to imagine a farm worker that goes to the field every day, and they experience 2 months in a row with every day above 105, 110 Fahrenheit, working under the sun for 2 months in a row. That's very extreme. Agriculture supports about 200,000 jobs in the San Joaquin Valley. And go back to Pablo.
Yes, thank you. And through these slides, the idea is to try to show you how climate change in the valley is impacting our people. And of course, many of you are familiar with these communities in the valley because either you live in the communities or you work with the communities. But for those not familiar, this is how some frontline communities look like. And some are bigger, some are smaller, but many are surrounded by agriculture. And next slide. And Angel already mentioned extreme heat. And this extreme heat increases the risk of heat stroke and other direct effects on people, particularly for other workers, many of which tend to have low income jobs like farm workers. And then higher temperatures also represent a risk for families who either don't have air conditioner or can't afford to pay for the electricity bill. This rising heat is also a problem during the night, because night temperatures during summer are also getting hotter, and it makes it harder to sleep and to recover before another day of hard work. And having low sleep quality decreases our immune system, among other health effects. Higher temperatures, as we have been saying, dry out and vegetation and enhance the conditions for wildfires that lead to heavy smoke. And then farm workers need to keep harvesting everyone's food. Higher temperatures, next slide, please. Higher temperatures also increase evaporation, or the water that is used by plants. And then this potentially increase the water use, and again, mainly for agriculture. And this could mean that agriculture would depend even more heavily on groundwater, further lowering groundwater levels, mostly affecting people with fewer resources, reducing water access, and degrading water quality. And the reality is that we didn't need to wait for climate change to see that. Many of these inequities were already happening since decades ago. But we have seen it many times already that climate change is making these inequities even worse. And during this drought that started in 2020, there has been over 1,000 reports of wells failing, wells going dry, or wells that increase in the contaminations of pollutants increase in many of these wells, and again, mostly in disadvantaged communities. Overpumping groundwater also increases the concentrations of some contaminants, and as we get more droughts, we will likely see more overpumping and therefore worse water quality. Next slide. Many people in the San Joaquin Valley, probably even some of you in this call, depend on bottled water as their main source for drinking water. And this, of course, represents an extra expense for many people in communities. Some people need to go either to their neighbors or to their neighbor's house who may have a deeper well or whose water hasn't been contaminated, or other people may need to pay for an interim water tank to bring some water to their homes. In many cases, community members need to use this bottled water also for cooking because they don't trust the water with a good reason. And we also have talked to people that said that whenever they drink some of this water, they either get an intense headache, or other people said that whenever they have a shower with it, even they develop some rashes. And by the way, have you carried one of those water bottles? They are very heavy and hard to move. And lastly, as we have more precipitation in terms of rain and less precipitation coming as snow, it means that we will have more water runoff in less amount of time, potentially creating floods. And floods in communities also hit different, because even a bit of rain can create a flooding area that makes it difficult to cross the street, to go to school, or to get to the bus stop. And sometimes it's even hard just to get out of home. So what can we do to mitigate some of these impacts and to adapt to the impacts that can't be stopped? I will pass it back to Angel, who will let us know about some of these strategies.
Thank you, Pablo. We have options. Pedro outlined a few of them before. And I guess good news is that agriculture can help mitigate climate change. And you know, agriculture is everywhere in the San Joaquin Valley. San Joaquin Valley can in fact become a world leader if everyone, especially farmer, receives the right incentives. And I know I may speak a little bit about agriculture or a lot, but it's because everything in the San Joaquin Valley is surrounded by agriculture. And if we are able to implement a positive change in agriculture, that can have an incredible ripple effect over the whole San Joaquin Valley. So right now, conventional agriculture is responsible for a significant part of the greenhouse gas emissions in California, almost 8%. But with adequate practices and some research, agriculture can help offset greenhouse gas emissions even from other industries. So we were talking about earlier snowmelt. So to control this earlier snowmelt, we can do more aquifer recharge, and that can be done in farmlands like this in this picture or elsewhere, which is fantastic because it can improve the water security for rural disadvantaged communities. Agriculture can also fight climate change with climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture to promote carbon storage, carbon sequestration that provides healthy soils, more water storage, more nutritious food. It creates habitat for nature, even for endangered species, cleans water, cleans the air, and other co-benefits or positive externalities that benefit everyone in California. Using renewable energy is extremely important. This is an example of a project covering Californian canals with solar panels. It reduces the evaporation of the canals, of the water in the canals, and this cooling effect of the water increases the efficiency of the solar panels. And UC Merced, by the way, is implementing this project along with the Turlock Irrigation District in some canals. Repurposing cropland in multi-benefit projects inside and around disadvantaged communities is also a very promising approach to make communities and farmers and landowners happy. This idea is to shield vulnerable communities from the source of environmental injustice. The worst pollution normally comes from fracking and oil extraction, but we all know that agricultural practices are very harmful, especially pesticides, dairies, fertilizer. And in this case, we suggest to retire cropland to save water, to reduce fertilizer and pesticide use, and then repurposing those lands into green areas, areas of aquifer recharge, clean industry, solar energy generation and storage, and wildlife refuges, and other opportunities or other uses of the land that can create socioeconomic and environmental opportunities for the local communities and also for the landowners. And to finish our presentation, we have a suggested to-do list. Of course, it's just a hint of all the things that we have to do because there's a lot to do. But I think it's very important that we increase the resilience for every group and everything that is now vulnerable. For example, for rural frontline communities, proper investments are super necessary. They are really essential in emergency management, in infrastructure, in health services, in education, in green areas, in sidewalks, as we were saying before. And we need to end the source of the problems, such as fracking, oil extraction, pesticides, fertilizers, especially inside the communities, but also near those disadvantaged communities. Inclusion of the disadvantaged communities in policy, in research, in every project and every process that involves them is also essential. And we cannot assume that we know what is best for a community if we don't go there and we ask the neighbors and we ask their leaders what they want. Clear energy sources, for cooling and heating are also very important, are the way to go. We need to stop burning fossil fuels to generate energy. Everyone knows that burning fossil fuels is toxic and destroys our planet, but we have seen over the last weeks how the economy of the United States and Europe is extremely vulnerable to dictatorships and autocracies such as Russia. So if we had the right investments in renewable energy 20 years ago, now our economy would be much more resilient and not affected by the scarcity of fossil fuels provoked by the Russia-Ukraine conflict or other conflicts that unfortunately exist. Climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture, repurposing cropland, automation, precision farming, carbon markets, all of them are outstanding opportunities, and we need to create technology and science that is accessible to everyone and that is shared as much as possible with farmers. It's also time to start thinking about strategically retiring agricultural land in a way that does not hurt anyone, especially small farmers and disadvantaged communities. Science must invest in the future of agriculture and its sustainability, multi-benefit projects based on community engaged research. And it's time for farmers and environmentalists to become friends. I would say to become best friends, because that's the way to go if we want to survive climate change. Our degraded ecosystems need better management to become more resilient. This way we may be able to record more areas like the national refuges that we have in the San Joaquin Valley, in Pixley, in Merced, San Luis. And perhaps we need to define new concepts of ecosystems, for example, fertilizer-free and pesticide-free agriculture that fosters our environment, endangered species, and even creating green areas around them. And gracias a todos. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask in English or in Spanish, as you prefer.
Great, thank you, Angel and Pablo. You can go ahead and stop sharing screen so we can all look at each other and have some conversation. So there's a few good comments in the chat. One came from, let me see if I could find it. It was from Mary Elizabeth. I am wondering how we will ever resolve governance that issue statement of overriding consideration based on business as usual economic analysis. So that was a comment that we had in the chat. Feel free to answer it back in the chat, or if you guys want to respond to that comment live. We also have two questions, one being from Naui: does adding solar panels to canals disrupt local ecosystems? That's one question. We have another one in the chat from Amy saying that they work on climate change and environmental justice units for K through 12 students in California with some resources free and available to teachers. So what role do you think K-12 schools, teachers, and students can play in helping reduce current and future problems? What are some of the best phenomena or data sets they could work with in the Valley? And then the most current comment question in the chat is the new current issue of the Diaries of Methane in Merced County in El Nido. It is coming to your neighborhood. So these are just some of the few questions and comments that we've been getting through the chat. So I don't know if Angel or Pablo, if you guys want to take a stab at any of these comments or questions.
We can follow the order, and Pablo and also Chantelis, feel free to jump in if you want. I mean, I can read again the question. The first one is Maria Elizabeth. I'm wondering how we will ever resolve governance that issue statements of overriding consideration based on business as usual. Maria Elizabeth, I would say that business as usual is getting, it's a joke nowadays. No, we are seeing how vulnerable the economy of the world is, and we are suffering a lot from these business as usual considerations. Maybe Pablo can give another point of view.
Yes, if I'm understanding the word correctly, now it's like the business as usual basically brought us to where we are today. No, so how can we, how do we still base many of our decisions on this business as usual? And it's part of this capitalist lifestyle that we currently have. And I was a couple of days thinking about an institution or an organization that focuses on providing services to the growth companies, because we value too much money, but we don't value life quality and many other things. So how can we start reducing some companies to sustainable levels by creating some other value that it doesn't base only on money, that it based on how happy your workers are, how good services do you provide to people, and how much more, I don't know, kind of happiness, or just be more creative on more values that is not only sold by money. No, I think that would be my response there. And I will go ahead and with the next question. Does adding solar panels to canals disrupt local economy? Angel, probably you're more familiar with that one. Sorry, local ecosystems, not a canal.
A canal is already disrupting local ecosystems. So yeah, basically it will improve the local ecosystems, no? Because it will reduce the amount of sunlight that arrives to the water. So it will reduce algae bloom, and I mean, it can improve conditions. So there is no production in a canal. No, basically it goes from, and sometimes it's runoff from agriculture, so they are not very clean either. So yeah, in principle, I would say it doesn't, but and maybe in some cases it could.
Yeah,
so,
it's considering like concrete canals, no, or canals that goes for
yes,
agriculture and mostly don't have a species of fish or aquatic species. Like, of course, we're not talking about putting solar panels on rivers or anything like that.
Yeah, those are big canals, and they have to be sturdy to endure the weight of the canal, the solar panels. And yeah, sometimes the canals run dry, you know, it depends on when the water and where the water is needed. I can read the next one is Amy Frame. We are working on climate change and environmental justice units for K-12 students in California. That's amazing, Amy Frame, because we're part of a educational nonprofit and we focus a lot on K-12. Children are the future. That's the way to go. I mean, we have to teach children about these things if we want that something is done in the future. And they are the most affected by future climate change. No? So they are the most involved in this issue. And thank you for sharing the link. I will look at that later. What role do you think K-12 schools, teachers, and students can play in helping reduce current and future problems? What are some of the best phenomena or data sets they could work with in the San Joaquin Valley? Question is for, okay, your email, thank you so much. But those are amazing questions. There are many things to talk about. I think talking to children, when we prepare our workshops, we always try to make them fun. So the kids have a lot of fun doing something. And it's not, you don't need to go directly to climate change. So you can explain how an ecosystem works. You can explain how a sensor works, how math works, and then you relate everything, explaining what happens with climate and what happens with something is not working well. Also, I think it has to be holistic perspective when we see climate change, no? And because everything is involved, is human behavior, but also technology is involved, and obviously ecosystems. So I think taking a holistic approach is very good, especially for children, doing something that is fun for them, not only catastrophic, because it's very scary for some children. No? So you cannot go directly and scare them because it's very scary. I mean, it's scary for us. So just imagine for children. Pablo or Chantelis, do you have any take on it?
Sure. Another role for teachers now is fighting disinformation. There is a lot of disinformation, mostly coming from the fossil fuel industry. So really teachers need to teach our children these different sides. No, one is coming from science, one is coming from greed and from people that wants to keep in power and keep making billions and billions of dollars destroying our planet. So really teach that to our children. And for the data that Amy is asking, I just put in the chat, it's caladapt.org, and there is a lot of information or data for climate change in the whole state, but there are some specific data for the San Joaquin Valley.
I just had a couple of comments. One on, hi, my name's Chantalise. I worked on the CCCA with Angel and Pablo, and the business as usual question, I think that's really, really relevant to climate change. And I think it's where we get stuck because we're so entrenched in our economic system, and it's really the culprit here. And we talk about new technologies. It's we kind of get, it becomes this trap where we want to develop these technologies to help with this climate change problem, but it also can contribute again to the climate change problem. So we have to be very careful in introducing new technologies because it becomes an opportunity for more capitalistic ventures. And I just wanted to put that discussion out there. It gets really tricky. But then going back to how we can instruct children on climate change, I really see them more as the teachers. I feel like they tend to, because they aren't so entrenched as we are as adults, and it is their future, and they are aware of it. And as a mother myself, I'm astounded at how wise children are, and I do think it's important that we keep in mind that it is terrifying for them, and we have to be careful on what we teach them, and empower them as much as possible, and get them excited about what they can do and how they can contribute, and that they are important, and we're not abandoning them. And those were the two comments I had.
It's an excellent observation, Chantalise. Thank you. Like, maybe we should teach children that they can do something, and then we explain what's going on. Oh, but yeah, giving them the tools to do something, I think is very important to empower them. Yes, very, very well put, Chantalise. We have another comment from Patricia Ramos Anderson saying the new current issue of the dairies and methane in Merced County in El Nido, it's coming to your neighborhood. I mean, you know, the San Joaquin Valley, especially the southern San Joaquin Valley, is the most productive dairy region in the United States by far. And the conditions are not ideal, and it's very difficult to track. There are no tools from the government to track methane emissions from dairies. There is no, at least to my knowledge, I haven't found any good database pinpointing dairies. For example, when we talk about repurposing cropland, we don't know where the dairies are. We know more or less where there is a lot of nitrate and where is some crops that are probably food for the cows, but we don't know where the dairies are. So it's very difficult to do something aggregated at the San Joaquin Valley or the Central Valley level to pinpoint dairies. They are very powerful, and I mean, yeah, well, that's something for policy making. We have here, well, Patricia Ramos de nuevo said, public health versus profit, no mandated standard guidelines or mitigation. There are more water districts and accountability. For these new industries, for dairies and methane processing, legislation to save our drinking water and environment, education. Those comments make a lot of sense. You know, Patricia, is sometimes it's very difficult to not telling someone to don't buy 500 cows more. Yeah, it's very difficult, and cows use a lot of water, a lot of water, because they need low value crops, and they, on the other side, probably cows will be displaced because with higher temperatures, I mean, extreme temperatures can kill the cows, and maybe there won't be enough pasture in the San Joaquin Valley, and they will have to go to the mountains or maybe to another state. So yeah, it's not going to be easy for agriculture.
Thank you, Pablo and Angel. I know that there's still a few comments and questions on there. I'm not sure if you guys want to drop any of your contact information or some way that folks can maybe reach out to you if they have any additional comments or questions that they'd like to share. I know some folks are still kind of diving into the report a little bit, so we can definitely drop the links to the English and the Spanish versions of these reports that you guys all worked on, and maybe they can digest it a little bit and then have some conversation, follow up with some conversation. But before the night kind of ends, wanted to just quickly, present on some of the ways that folks can engage with CVAQ in the same vein of trying to, advocate for climate change and cleaner air. This Thursday, the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District is having their board meeting. You can join and let them know about any your concerns over any climate change issues, any air quality issues. Your voice is definitely important. And I know that kind of goes to some of the comments we were seeing in the chat about how to, hold our decision makers accountable and how to try to advocate for them to change the decisions that they make. We also have a protect yourself resource list on our website on ways that you can protect yourself from air quality during bad air days. And you can also follow us on Twitter or Facebook to keep up with the latest kind of any advocacy efforts that we share. We share events like this, the one we're hosting tonight, and other opportunities to engage and uplift climate justice and air quality issues throughout the Valley. So with that, if you guys have anybody has any closing comments, Pedro, Angel, Pablo, if you guys have any closing comments, and then I'll be dropping some links in the chat.
Yeah, I can add a couple of thoughts. First of all, thank you everyone for staying on. I know this is after work and after XYZ other things y'all were doing today, so I do want to express my appreciation on behalf of CVAQ, and also just to say, we are all, I know there's a lot of cool groups on here at this call right now. We're all trying to work for a better San Joaquin Valley, and we're all in the middle of a lot of campaigns as well too. So if you are interested, again, in just staying up to date with what the current efforts are to make sure that we can realize these victories that we all want and deserve, follow us and follow a lot of the groups on this call as well. And then I'll also just say, this is one of many conversations we'll be hosting here this year and moving forward as CVAQ. So, we do want to keep providing information and making sure that whatever we're doing is responsive to the needs and the desires and the will of folks here in San Joaquin Valley. So, stay in touch. We want to make sure we have a clean, resilient valley for everyone, and that's a partnership between us all. So, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for joining. Again, this was being recorded, so we will follow up with a thank you and the link to the YouTube when it is ready. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.